I'm going to get started. I know that I want to make sure we leave ample time for discussion if there is any. So I'm going to just basically, get going here. I'm also home today. We had an ice storm, so you're going to see a lot of background noise and chatter. I'll try to stay muted as much as possible. So this talk is called SimplyTestme, the future built from the past. And hopefully this is the Florida Drupal camp, but I just hopped in a Zoom room. So if I'm in the wrong place, I apologize. But yeah, we're all looking forward to talking with you all today. And I've tried to bring together kind of a group of presenters in specific areas that will help to kind of give a really, sort of well-rounded picture of what is going on with SimplyTest. A lot of this has sort of DevOps implications, and we'll try our best to hit on those as we get through the slides here today. But with us today is myself, Adam Bergstein. I'm the lead of SimplyTestme. We have AmyJune with us today as well, and she sort of heads up all of our marketing efforts and outreach for community. We have Matt Glaman, who's here sort of as our architect for our new work that we're doing. And then we also have James Sansbury from TugboatQA, and he's going to talk a lot about how the Tugboat service sort of operates, within SimplyTestme, which is very, very much kind of a DevOps use case. So without further ado, there we go. So here's a little bit about what we're planning to talk about in this discussion. So we have a little bit of kind of the mission and vision and project history. I might have switched those. I apologize. Some last minute changes. We'll talk a little bit about the future direction. Matt's going to spend time talking about our brand new Drupal 9 system. James is going to talk a lot about TugboatQA, and then we'll open the floor for questions at that point in time. Okay, AmyJune, you're up.
Okay, so I want to preface this with there's roofers today, so I will have roofing noise all throughout this Florida Drupal camp, so please have patience with me. I'm AmyJune Hineline. I work in the community. I work with Kanopi Studios, but SimplyTestme is near and dear to my heart because I am a non-code developer who works on the Drupal project, and so SimplyTestme for me is the spark of light of this project that helps folks who don't have all of the check boxes that developers have when they come into DevOps. And so really we wanted to offer we want to continue to offer a free open source tool for our community members to use, and some of these highlights include the ability to create test and demo instances of Drupal and add other projects and different instances and configurations to the mix. The browser-based solution really allows users to try out those specific configurations and user stories and use cases, and you can change them on the fly. A user can also test patches by feeding in a patches URL or test changes to projects. We have created test installation options and profiles and one-click demos that makes spinning up a Drupal site relatively easy. And we want to maintain a button for use in the Dredd editor and the issue queue. And if we go to the next screen, for those who aren't familiar with Dredd editor, it's a browser extension for Chrome and Firefox that injects a couple of really handy buttons into the issue queue, and one of them being that SimplyTestme button. It literally creates a one button thing that a person can click on, and a site spawns with all the correct version of the project and metadata and the URL attached. So it really lowers the burden to Drupal queue, the Drupal.org issue queue as well. And I'm ready to move on. So the idea behind SimplyTestme, is browser-based environments are really easier to share. Some of the folks that this benefits are non-code developers, those who have machines that don't support robust Docker solutions, folks who might have limited time to work in the issue queue. So not only like it helps with your development workflow, but it helps you, in the collaboration project in Drupal. But it really comes down to lowering that barrier to entry. SimplyTestme does that for a number of folks. Spinning up a site and sharing it with others benefits not only developers, but it can help everyone on your team, your sales team, your marketing people who want to, they want to quickly demo the project for a potential client. And SimplyTestme has the one-click setups for Umami and Commerce, so potential clients can really see what Drupal has to offer in a out-of-the-box capacity. But how do we, as a team, work on our own internal collaboration? And you can share the next slide. It's important for us to have very visible collaboration spaces, and we work really hard on maintaining, full transparency with the project. We are always in the need for more contributors, not only coders, but designers and testers and marketing folks, and for wider visibility and collaboration, we do this in a number of ways. We maintain a community project queue on Drupal.org, and we maintain a Drupal Slack channel. And we try, like I said, we try to keep all those communications and tickets visible. That way they're out there and they're there for longevity for folks who want to get back to those. We also have the privilege of having core mentors promote the dreaded or SimplyTestme functionality in Contrib workshops. When mentoring folks, the leads will demo the dreaded button for folks whose maybe first time contribution might be just reviewing a patch, and so they can simply click that button and be on their way to their first contribution. We've entered the project previously into the Google Summer of Code, and we offered an experience that other projects just didn't. And at that time, I think it was 2018 or 2019, we were looking to rebuild Drupal 8 and integrate with Tugboat. So it gave, some novices some pretty good solid work to work on. And then again, contribution leads and Drupal mentor leads hold space for collaboration during Contrib days. So we open up the workflow for everyone. And the next slide, I lead into a shameless plug that Florida Drupal Camp is having Contrib Day on Sunday. And we do have first-time contributor workshops, so I will be demoing a lot of different use cases for SimplyTestme. And then there'll be separate contribution rooms for different planned initiatives, and SimplyTestme is going to be there. And that runs about from noon to 3:30. So thank you, Adam.
Cool. All right. I want to do just a few slides. That was great, AmyJune. Thank you. That was awesome. I want to do a few slides a little bit just on the history of the project. I think now everyone should have a sense of like why we're here, the purpose, the goals, what we're trying to do, etc. So I'll get into a little bit of kind of how this all came about. So the earliest recollection I could find, both on Drupal.org and even using the Wayback Machine, which I was kind of enjoying this exercise as I was putting this slide together, was dating back to October 17th of 2012. And on October 17th, ironically, they were having some theming issues when the site was up and built. There was no styling, there was no images being rendered. So like that must have been the last holdout for launching it. But SimplyTestme was created by an individual named Patrick Drotlov, who his Drupal.org handle is Patrick D. And the project itself was released shortly after Drush. So like I think Drush was first, and it's already 11 years old, by the way. It just had I think 6 months ago, I think it turned 11. And so technically speaking, SimplyTestme came out right in the cusp of like the Drupal 6 to Drupal 7 transitions. At the time, SimplyTestme though was able to support earlier versions of Drupal as well. So things like Drupal 4, Drupal 5, ironically, were still, in the wild at that time, believe it or not. And so SimplyTestme was able to kind of serve all of those spaces when it first came out. And that's a screenshot from 11/17/2012 of the project with its first sponsor and the first limited functionality that it had, which was just the project and version dropdown. So pretty cool stuff here, just for a little history lesson. And if you look at a kind of complicated networking closet and you see a whole bunch of wires and and things that are all like slogged together, that's probably a good analogy for how a lot of the parts of the SimplyTest infrastructure was set up. But at the time when SimplyTest was set up, it was highly innovative. There wasn't things like Docker. There wasn't things like um, Kubernetes or any of these kind of cool technologies that we make use of today to do some similar things, especially in DevOps. And so some kind of tidbits around the early architecture is it was all custom coded and very, very uniquely configured to do this. The front end was a Drupal application. Web server. So we have a web server instance. That's was directly what people were hitting when they would go to the site. And then on the back end of it was what we call worker servers, and those were load balanced and very, very, very highly custom configured using a technology called LXC, which was a precursor to Docker. And those images would basically be cloned and you could put them on multiple servers, and then you would have to reconfigure each instance every time it was deployed. And then you would have basically the backend load balancing solution. And so it was very, very, very interesting. But the workflow was basically like someone would hit the website, they would request metadata from Drupal.org about the project, they would submit what they want, that would go to our worker servers with all the data that needed to be configured for the instance. Those worker servers would spawn an instance of SimplyTest to, based on the specification that the user wanted. It would basically log and monitor that, and when the instance is ready, that would be sent back to the web server with a built environment. That's the last piece down here, and voila, SimplyTest would build a Drupal site on demand. Under the hood, there was a lot of kind of cool things at the time that I think SimplyTest made use of Let's Encrypt as like kind of a very early tool to do SSL certificate management on these worker servers. It also made use of HA proxy because there was a lot of moving parts under the hood, and HA proxy could basically manage that much more elegantly. And then LXC was kind of used for like backing up all of the instances of images that were running certain things and made it very fluid to kind of copy, clone, provision, deprovision things very easily. On the worker servers themselves, though, it really very much is like a Apache web server virtual host with a monolithic MySQL database, and is very similar to what we see on Drupal sites today. But the configuration and the provisioning parts of those were very ephemeral in nature. So I love this image, like, by the way, like, because I try to explain to some non-technical folks, like, what is technical debt? And this image always like hits me of like, hey, take some wheels, like this will help you move a little faster, but they're like, no, we're too busy solving our technical debt, right? And I also posted the link to the article that I usually reference in terms of explaining these things. But some of the limitations around SimplyTest with the architecture that was in before it was very fragile and it was very dated. Like there's the industry itself has done a lot of great things with cloud infrastructure, with containers, with orchestration tools. It's that SimplyTest could and should have been rewritten probably 5 or 6 times in that time frame, right? With all the cool stuff that was coming up. Um, but the thing that really kind of affects SimplyTest, given our vision, is we're fully volunteer, we're fully open source, and we rely on just the goodwill of people to keep this going. And we have to be very conscious and very focused on the maintenance burden that we have. And SimplyTest is not just an open source project, but it's a service. So when we look at these things, we have to be concerned about the customer service aspects and respond to people if they find bugs. We have all of the systems administration and updates that need to be done, from Drupal updates to Linux updates to everything across the board. We need to make sure that the system runs properly as new Drupal versions come out, as new versions of Drush come out, as new versions of Composer come out. So there is definitely a very high maintenance overhead to keep the system running effectively for people as Drupal and as the community evolves and changes. Over time as well, there were also no development servers. Like, all of the servers that were sponsored were fully provisioned to run the service itself. There was no easy or readily available way to do that. I did a pet project like a while ago. I want to say like 18 odd plus months ago, trying to spin up a whole development environment, and I was effective to a degree at getting that moving. But again, there's so much custom configuration built into things that it was a very challenging exercise at the time. And keep in mind that we don't have any dedicated contributors, probably outside of myself. We've had people that have helped out here and there. It's been really fantastic to have this group of people pitch in, but we're not tapping into some wealth of community members that are participating that we can swarm on things, or really make a huge dent in a short amount of time. And one of the other big limitations is we had no money. So we were really at a deficit. All of the servers that SimplyTest was running on were paid for by sponsors, but we didn't have any money to get help or pay for help or anything like that. So this really kind of sets the landscape of kind of a pretty doom and gloom perspective that SimplyTest was kind of facing, right? Uh, and then I took over, and that's me, by the way, if you can't see me on camera. But Patrick D kind of threw up his hands. He said, "You know what? Hey, this isn't for me anymore. I'm feeling burnout. I'm ready to be done." And he posted an issue in Drupal.org, basically requesting new maintainership. And his key goal, like, really was trying to honor the spirit of the project, making sure that it lived on in responsible hands, and making sure that it wasn't swooped up by a company, or it wasn't that it really stayed true to the foundational parts of why it was created. And I wanted to be very sensitive to that, as well. So I made a proposal to take it over and have that be, one of the main focuses of things that I focus on as a community member, and truly tried to, and still to this day, try to honor exactly the motivations and mission and vision of the project as it was originated. Then came the revitalization. So, and we're really in a lot of, this is an iterative thing. We're never done. But I, made a few really strategic things to make sure that this was put in better standing. First being, I wanted to make sure that we had way more active maintenance on it, because users were experiencing problems. New versions of Drush weren't available. There was a lot of things that just kind of were sort of breaking, and the community was moving much faster than what SimplyTest could keep up with. So we wanted to make sure that there was good maintenance practices built in, as a baseline. Secondly, I tapped AmyJune to help out with really the marketing of the project. We needed to do a lot of outreach. We really needed to expand and talk about what we were doing as a project, make sure it was related to what the community members wanted. And the third bullet here is we opened up an open collective for donations. The key in this is that we've been able to pay for the cost of things that we need, like SSL certificates. We've paid specific contributors to help out in ways that have moved the project forward very strategically. And so that's been really helpful, and we really appreciate all the people that have sponsored, to make that possible and even happen. And Centauro sponsored a one-click demo feature on the site that actually brought a lot of joy to people using the system, which was really great. And that was a pluggable infrastructure. So now other contributors can make their own one-click demos if they want to the project within, kind of how we try to govern things. And finally, we were able to completely remove the whole back half of our worker servers, where we replaced that with TugboatQA, and James is here to give us a lot more of the how and why. So I don't want to steal his thunder. But we also have a couple other revitalization efforts here that I'm going to speak to in a few minutes, and we'll talk about that as sort of the future state. The question you all probably are curious about is, like, why is this DevOps? Why do we care? And you could see that, I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that there are key differences, but complementary parts of Agile versus DevOps, where we have Agile as like a cycle, and, you do 2-week sprints and you kind of go through that whole cycle and have ceremonies around all of that. And SimplyTest kind of fits into Agile workflows, from a community perspective, like where people will use SimplyTest to do some of like the architectural designing of tools or systems or test patches. They'll develop systems with it to see and test how things work as like a proof of concept, or they could even use it for testing specific patches and doing things. So complementary, the purpose around SimplyTest is very Agile in nature. And DevOps, though, in terms of its, kind of cycle, also operates in very similar ways. But I look at DevOps more as a sort of technology lens, and Agile being more of a practice. But from a technology perspective, the way that SimplyTest is engineered very much represents a DevOps use case. There's a lot of microservices involved. There's a lot of infrastructure as code. We work inside of ephemeral infrastructure to like provision things for users as they want to test or as they want to perform work. And things are very much kind of like using containers and using, a lot of like the same related DevOps technologies that you see, in many implementations. So I look at SimplyTest very much as like a representative example of what you can do with DevOps in the world. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to James to talk a lot more about Tugboat.
Yeah. Speaking of, ephemeral infrastructure and microservices. Hey, everybody. My name's James, and I work for Tugboat. So Tugboat's a tool that Lullabot built. So technically, I work for Lullabot. But yeah, like as Adam's mentioned, Tugboat's kind of the machinery that's powering all the actual environments for SimplyTestme. And I wish I could actually tell you all the nerdy details of how, that is wired up, and maybe we can dig into that in the Q&A, because I don't know a lot about it myself. But maybe if you are here for your own projects and for stepping up your DevOps game for your teams, your projects, your sites, your ears probably could perk up at this point, because I'm going to tell you what Tugboat is at its core and how that can step up that game for you. So at its essence, you can go ahead and click the next. There you go. At its essence, Tugboat is hosting for anything pre-production. So it's all Docker based under the hood. It's very flexible. So it's a tool you can use to create testing environments with both production-like infrastructure, so that's that infrastructure as code, and production-like data, which is pretty rare in this sort of space, even including that 50 gig database that nobody wants to pull to like the staging server because it would take 3 hours. Tugboat can spin you up a site with that in a couple minutes. And while most, we don't want to go to your Gmail, Adam.
I clicked on the slide and it popped up. I I don't know what happened.
Oh, there you go.
That was so weird.
So while most CI services focus on running a few scripts on like discrete containers and then just like once it's done destroying everything, Tugboat integrates your whole project, brings it to life, and then gives you a URL to see that sticks around. So it can detect new pull requests and then within a few minutes spit out a URL, bring that pull request to life, and then even run visual regression tests, accessibility tests. It can give you shell access, all sorts of goodies. And as we're seeing with how SimplyTestme is using it, it's not opinionated about where a production site is. In this case, we're just pulling code from Drupal.org and wiring that stuff up. And for your projects, you know, the servers could be on AWS, Acquia, Pantheon, or even like some ivory tower protected by 3,000 layers of red tape. So what that means for you all, if you're here at Drupal Camp, trying to step up your own process, that means you can standardize and streamline your DevOps workflow, no matter if you're a freelancer with just a few clients or a large enterprise with like that heavily guarded basement full of rack servers. And it doesn't matter if your project's a simple static site or like a fancy network of bespoke microservices, or maybe you work for an agency, you have lots of clients, and all those clients have a variety of hosting needs. You can use Tugboat to create that standardized workflow, prototype, test, demo, all the things, every step of the way throughout the project. So yeah, this was, you know, maybe more of a little bit of a commercial break for the SimplyTestme stuff. But definitely reach out if you're interested in any of that stuff. I'm around at Drupal Camp this week, and you can shoot us an email. We have a Slack channel. Also, definitely follow us on Twitter at TugboatQA. We've got lots of exciting stuff coming up. So ta-da, yeah, that's the end of the commercial break.
Thanks. And I always appreciate seeing Bernice on in slides and, you know, in the wild. So cool. Thank you, James. That was awesome. Before we turn the floor over to Matt for more of a deep dive in Drupal 9, I do want to talk about what you've heard thus far is really where we are as a project right now. We have done some modernization of putting Tugboat in as our backend, very heavy revamping of the Drupal logic and configuration in that lens. And that was a big win for the project to help stabilize that. And I do want to thank the Tugboat team for their sponsorship of that service. It really has been very high impact for us. I'm going to spend some time talking about where we're going as a project to look how we can continue to level this up. I could best summarize kind of where I want to see things go by using this statement. I want to focus only on the application. I want all of the community contribution to be explicitly focused on that. I want everything else in and around and in helping to be completely automated, if not very light maintenance of things. And I believe very strongly that success looks like having a situation where it's very easy for anybody in the Drupal community and outside of the Drupal community to come in and participate in this project with a heavy, heavy focus on the application itself. If we hit this goal, I think that is a key marker that shows a significant amount of progress in this system and where it's going, but also puts the system, the whole project in a position of success moving forward. One of the things that I heard from people a long time ago was, boy, it looks dated. And I agree. And I worked very closely with Anna Laura Koto, who's a Drupal community member, and also Iris Ebekwe, who works at Civic Actions, to create a new theme for SimplyTestme. This has not been launched yet. We actually started doing this in Drupal 7, but then we pivoted to move this only into our Drupal 8 and 9 infrastructure that we're building, simply because we didn't want to waste that investment of time and effort. And here's a brief snapshot of how this looks now. We had this recently refreshed with, you know, with the help of Anna Laura to help, represent some of the new advanced options and some of the one-click demo features that weren't available at the time. I think everyone so far that has reviewed this agrees that this is a really welcomed fresh coat of paint, even though it may look or have the same, behavior, I guess, that's currently available. So I want to give a lot of credit to Anna Laura and Iris for really helping kind of better visualize the project and make it a lot, more modern looking. We recently came up with, again, our goal of modernization is really just to focus on the application. The last bastion of maintenance outside of the application is really the web server. And the web server is running our current Drupal 7 SimplyTestme. And we just opened up about a week ago or so an RFP to get community sponsorship for our web server from past vendors. And replacing this server, will offset a significant amount of the technical debt that is remaining in the project, and free, kind of open things up for new potentials. And that potentials includes development servers and on-demand servers that could encourage community contribution. And past vendors all have some very similar and nice features that we're evaluating on a case-by-case basis. Things like SSL certificate management and performing code updates, security features, and a whole lot more. Even some DevOps capabilities like running composer commands when we push updates. These are all really nice things that honestly will put our project in a position of automating a lot, opening up the door for more contribution, and also making it easier to do that, to move towards our pure focus, which is the application itself. We've opened the RFP to any past vendor in the spirit of making sure this is fully accessible to the community. It with assurances that that is sponsored. We have put together a committee of reviewers. I've listed them here to weigh options, to do as fair of an evaluation as we possibly can, and make sure that we give proper consideration to every vendor that submits for this. But this will be a really big win, I think, for the community. And we currently do have sponsors of our web servers today, and we want to honor them ongoing as well, even if we do move on from using that infrastructure. It's still a big win, I think, for the project. I don't want to get too far into the Drupal 9 work because I don't want to steal Matt's thunder coming up here. But not only do we want to replace the web server, but we want to replace the whole system that it's running on. And I will say that the collaboration between Matt Glaman, myself, Ofer Shaw, I don't know if he's here, and AmyJune and others, even the Tugboat folks have been helping out a lot with using their systems and their APIs in the way that they've made a lot of improvements even in the last, since we rolled this out originally. Our Drupal 9 system is drastically simplified from what we are running today. with Drupal 7. It is something I'm very proud of. I think it is something that we are putting our best foot forward. I remember anecdotally a pull request that Matt submitted to Drupal.org that even in an iteration of Drupal 9, as we were building things and exploring these solutions, Matt removed like 2,000 lines of code and replaced it with something that was drastically more straightforward. This is the kind of work that is high impact for the project to make it much more accessible to people, much easier to contribute. And we have a lot going on with this work that will tremendously benefit the project. It also includes a fully decoupled React front end. The Drupal 9 system sort of serves as the governor between pulling data, pushing data, serving up data, storing instance metadata, putting that into Tugboat. And we're very much and very heavily using a lot of the microservices that Tugboat itself offers in a way that I think affords a significant reduction of technical debt in the space and is really going to put the project in a very strong position to succeed. With that being said, Matt, I want to turn it over to you to talk about in more depth what we're doing with Drupal.
All right, great, thanks. So before we got to the next slide. All right, one thing I wanted to just say before we go forward is I know people think of DevOps as just development operations. Once you hit git push, that's when DevOps takes hold. But I like to think of it as developer operations, not just development operations, but developer operations. It's how do you make the full stack work from somebody's local development to your developer workflow to when you push and deploy artifacts. Like it is the full pipeline, not just we now have code pushed, then do DevOps. So now we can go to the next slide and show where that concept comes in. So the existing SimplyTest site leverages Drupal's form API, which Drupal's form API is really verbose, but it does have its limits, especially around Ajax. Having worked on building Drupal Commerce 2, found that out the hard way, such as when using form API with Ajax, you can do Ajax operations on a select list changing, but if you do another select list, the state is lost because in the form API, state is only committed when you do a submit button. And sorry for any of the stomping, virtual schooling, and apparently it's gym class today. So one of the steps was to decouple the user interface from the backend. And JavaScript allows us to have a more robust form with nested options and dependent options. So if you pick a project, we get the versions for that project. Well, based off those versions, we know what Drupal core versions are available. And based off that Drupal core version, you can add additional projects and we can scope those versions. It's very nested, and that logic is inside the interface and can react to the data. So by decoupling that, we're able to put a lot of that business logic into the back end and keep things into the front end. And where this ties into developer operations, you can have somebody that understands JavaScript write the JavaScript that says, I have this data. You can have somebody that understands the back end to just provide that back end data. So if we go to the next slide, that's the benefits of decoupling. So now when working with the next iteration of SimplyTest, launching a sandbox is just a data definition contract. The backend receives the data, says, does this validate the contract? No, and then it tells the front end, you're missing this data. So now we can actually separate the concerns and make it easier to contribute. You don't need to be an expert at the form API to customize this form. And trust me, you don't want to necessarily become an expert at the form API. I've gone to the 7 layers of that, and it's not something that everybody should have to know to be able to contribute. Now you can just build a form and send the proper data. And so how we implemented that API is we actually used the type data system. I found out not too many folks are familiar with the type data system in Drupal, and that's because it's a very, 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 very low level API. So we do not use the RESTful Web Services module or the JSON API module because that was kind of a little bit of overhead. But what we've done is we created a data definition that represents the schema of the object, such as, there are projects. Well, a project has a short name and the version used. And then the launch definition takes a project, patches, and versions and so forth. And the type data system hooks into Symfony validation constraints, and we're able to validate that data object. Now, it might sound familiar because entities are type data objects as well. That's why you can validate entities. So we're just taking it down a whole level lower. And it's a very verbose low-level API. And on the next slide, I have a quick example of what that looks like. I know putting code into a slides isn't always the greatest, but it kind of helps visualize this. So if you defined a custom entity before, your base field definitions look the same because fields are type data properties. So we have, if you want to launch an instance on SimplyTestme, you need the project, Drupal version, an install profile, and the manual install, and any additional projects. So we're able to take a JSON blob and turn it into an object representing this data, which I can show on the next slide. So we're able to decode the content from a request in our route controller, pass that to the type data manager that says, hey, we've got this array. Here's the data definition. If there's an error, we can say, sorry, this wasn't processable. Like for some reason, we're able to create the instance, and then we can run validation against that data definition. And that will tell us if any of our previously defined constraints were broken. So now the front end would say, oh, hey, your Drupal version doesn't match when that's supported. Let's say somebody picked 8.3.0 or anything in that lifecycle, and we've decided, sorry, this doesn't receive security support anymore. We can't launch any 8.3 instances. The front end can react to that message without knowing any of this backend data, and then contributors can extend those validations using Symfony constraint plugins and all the tooling that we're used to. So again, the idea is to make it easier to contribute while also simplifying the logic. If you look at the existing logic, there's a lot of if this condition is set, and then you get the nested logic. It's now been put into the type data system with Symfony constraints. And we can go to the next one. So that kind of sent the snowball effect of going into optimizing and refactoring SimplyTestme. So we started rebuilding the front end, and then we realized we could optimize more of the back end. And two of these areas were around the Tugboat preview configuration generation and also advancements to the Tugboat API. As Adam brought up before, the technical debt discussion, where it's constantly doing support, maintenance, everything else, there wasn't time to necessarily improve the way that Tugboat configuration was generated or leverage advances in the API. So on the next slide, I can explain where we've been able to do that. So as James said, when you generate a Tugboat preview, it's like generating any kind of CI config. It's a YAML file that says you have some services, and here's a bunch of commands to run inside that container. So we worked on a new standard way to generate that configuration. So before, it would be just, it was actually pretty ingenious what Adam created. It would pass it to Drupal's render system, and you were able to provide parameters, and it would create that generation, but you had to actually commit that file to a repository. So it was using a GitHub API to commit that file output and just all these extra steps. So now there is a configuration generator that leverages plugins to generate that YAML. And that has now unified the custom build. When I say custom build, I mean the front end where you specify a project to launch with one-click demos. So instead of having two different ways to manage how a project is launched, it will be in one system with plugins. So that way, when it's the Umami one-click demo, or we'll say Umami build, or the commerce build, or a custom build, just those one-click demos provide some more specific actions into the build process versus being completely customizable. So we can go to the next slide and talk about how the new Tugboat API improved this. So as I said previously, it would have to commit that Tugboat file to a repo, because that's how Tugboat Tugboat works. You make commits. It's like a CI service. It reads the commits, reads the file, and does a thing. So that's what it was doing. But Tugboat has added an API endpoint that lets you create previews on demand by pushing that configuration, which I think is one beautiful outside of SimplyTest. Like that, it creates so many different capabilities if you use the service. But what this did is I was able to cut out so much code because we're just making instead of making an HTTP request to GitHub to commit a file and then look for the Tugboat job that triggers, we just call Tugboat and we get back the job IDs and we can start monitoring it. So it removes so much complexity, and this is going to make it even easier for contributors to work on it because you don't need to know this other system. You don't need to worry about having access to this GitHub repo to be able to develop locally. Up until this point now, you can actually do all the development and have it cancel out when it hits Tugboat because you don't have access keys, but you're able to review the generated Tugboat configuration and validate it that way. Like there's actually test coverage. We have PHP unit tests, not just like PHP unit kernel test suites, unit tests that generate this config based on the type data that's passed in, so you can manually review what's passed over. It's definitely a lot nicer to work with, and for a DevOps thing, DevOps is all about ensuring stability and ease of use, and we're moving greater to that part. Speaking of ease of use, on the next slide, I think this is going to take care of one of the biggest support issues, is the dreaded 113% error. So when a build would fail, or other times, the status tracker would say 113%, and that's kind of like a cryptic what? So the original SimplyTest and the updated one that currently uses Tugboat used callbacks. So as the build progressed, it would actually call back to SimplyTest and log status. And then the batch, when you watch the progress bar, it would check those status entries. Well, something would go awry and you'd end up with more than expected. But now, instead of having, we've deleted that code as well, and Tugboat allows you to stream logs. So when you're viewing the progress, we're actually following the API. We stream the log. The API tells us when we should refresh. So we respect that, which I love. Great API design. So thank you, Tugboat. So we're able to watch that. And the new build commands drop markers into the build output. So we say SimplyTest starting, SimplyTest patching, SimplyTest downloading, SimplyTest installing, whatever order. And the front end JavaScript reads that output and is able to tell you what's going on as we move forward. So that's super cool and should make it easier for us to provide better feedback as we're watching logs, because now someone could say, right now there's only 5 steps, but we should actually show this. Well, it's just adding a command output to the Tugboat system and then having the front end read those changes. So the next slide, the thing is, it's all about creating a relatable code base. There's definitely work still to be done, but it's moving towards a way to make it easier to contribute. With the decoupling, we can think of the Drupal backend as an API gateway. Like if we want to get all DevOpsy, it's an API gateway. It's a proxy to Tugboat. Like the front is not talking to Tugboat directly and exposing our secret. It's proxying commands there. So like the progress is actually making 2 Tugboat commands, one to get the job status, one to get the logs. And it's merging that data for us. And it's also an API gateway to Drupal.org's API. Instead of fetching data all the time live from Drupal.org, it's caching some of that data locally, so anybody could help contribute to make that a little bit faster. So I'm really excited, and I think the barriers to contribution are going to be lowered, which should always be a goal for developer operations. I didn't add a slide here, but there is a working local development stack, a composer project with DDev that lets you work on this locally. That's what I use. So that will be a continuous thing, is like, how can we make the developer experience better off for contributions and end user use. Thanks.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you so much. That was like really a great, kind of icing on the cake for the story that we're trying to tell here today. So thank you for helping us, share the narrative of the continuous improvement, which very much is in line with a DevOps mentality. At this point, I know we have about, I think, 5 minutes left officially to take questions. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Salim, tell me if I'm not correct, but
yeah, you're fine. We can take questions.
Okay, cool. So we'll pause and do so. You could post them in Zoom chat or feel free to hop off mute.
I have a question. What do you guys use for automation yourself for building SimplyTestme, like your own?
Yes, that's
yeah.
a great question. So first and foremost, we actually have 2 instances of Tugboat. So we have a development only Tugboat and we have a production Tugboat. So that's the one key piece. The second is Matt alluded to this about our local stack. So we have I think it's like a DDev image or something that can rapidly spin up, an instance of SimplyTest to run locally, and that solves that part of the puzzle. And then the PaaS infrastructure that we're looking to create will ultimately be our deployment pipeline of, shipping changes, testing them, deploying them into production. Does that answer your question, Salim?
Yeah.
Cool.
And then what? So yeah, the next one was, how do you guys do dev test live? I think you answered that. You had talked about taking stuff from the front end where the users specify what they want, and then Tugboat doing the build. Where is that separation? Like, you're creating the spec file and then you're passing that to Tugboat, and then I think Matt was talking about you had to commit that to Git first, and now you're doing it via the API. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yes, and I think part of it is, what are we doing today with Tugboat and where are we going, moving forward? I'd like to focus on where we're going because I think it's more elegant. Some of the concepts still remain the same. So for instance, the SimplyTest front end is a form, and that form allows end users to specify what they want to test. So those are like the requirements, right? Then the form is going to be passed in the future here into a config generation tool. And that maps the user input to the infrastructure as code that Tugboat understands. And that is passed through microservices, through APIs. It used to be passed through GitHub, where a new branch on GitHub with the spec was populated. So there was a significant reduction of technical debt when we cut out the middleman and went straight through the API. And in doing so, then we invoke the API, which we have kind of a pulse on that from the front end to pull the logs, to pull the status of that. So we have markers, as Matt was talking about. So all of the config generation that we're using embeds these kind of like, signs for us to like scrape and give the user a good experience around, seeing logs and getting information, checking for errors, things of that nature. But really there is a very logical separation of responsibilities where we have the React form that users can use to specify. We have the Drupal system that is building the configuration. That configuration then gets passed to Tugboat. So it's really a 3-tier flow with some interoperability in between.
Okay, is this a configuration file? I guess that's a configuration file that's like proprietary to Tugboat, or is this a general configuration file that anyone can read and figure out like what they need to package to create that
Yeah.
that distribution?
So the configuration that gets generated is the proprietary specification for Tugboat itself. However, it looks a whole lot like a Docker Compose file that has specific events in for Tugboat events. And the Tugboat events are their product specific features that they have put into that specification for things like rebuilding images and provisioning images and things of that nature. And they correspond specifically to features the Tugboat has in their product. And SimplyTest makes use of a lot of those features. Most notably, one we didn't talk about today is something called base previews. And this is really where the speed of SimplyTest comes in. And it's not very fast, just to be clear, but it could be worse. We make use of base previews that stand up things like Drupal 7, Drupal 8, Drupal 9, and you can rapidly copy a base preview, very much like what you can do with containers to clone them, and give you, give our customers basically like, a fresh copy of that that can be configured and rapidly cloned. So it does improve a lot of the speed of what's happening here.
Okay, thanks.
We did have a question on Zoom chat about does the issue queue, is it representative of everything that needs to be done for launch? No. We're working on that. I think like we would like to have at least a good chunk of that in place for the sprint day here as part of the camp. As AmyJune had alluded to earlier, that we have that kind of slated for contrib day. And Matt has been working on a contrib Kanban board to show that and give some visibility into what we need to do to move that forward. But both Matt and Ofer are kind of taking a look at like what needs to be done to finish a theme and what needs to be done to finish the back end. It's a little rough looking right now. I mean, I think there's definitely, a lot of things we need to like finish the sponsors. We need to do some theming cleanup. So it's definitely a work in progress. But I would say like, the end is near to getting this shipped. I don't have a date. I don't have any specifics, but it's definitely getting a lot closer to becoming a reality. And we're very excited by that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I'm going to stop sharing. I have an immediate hard stop in 2 minutes that I need to drop for, but I really do want to thank everyone, and especially my co-presenters today for all of their help and support in putting this together. And Salim, thank you for the invite. And we'll see you all soon.
Yeah,
Have a great
thanks.
camp.
Thank you everyone for doing this.
Yeah,
for
thanks
the
everybody.
SimplyTest. Yeah.